So welcome to episode 33 of the First Person Podcast with me, Lia Black, our commentaries editor, Chris Lawrence, our editor-in-chief, Sabrina Sgandurra, our associate commentaries editor, and our very own podcast producer, Giuseppe Femia. In this episode, we've each got a role to play as we dig into the experiential aspects of role-playing games. From pen and paper to tabletops and minis to the controller at our fingertips, role-playing games have come a long way, and what each of us gets from them speaks not only to our personal needs and desires, but those of the games as well. Without further ado, let's roll initiative. I am Lia Black. I'm the commentary section editor at First Person Scholar, and you can find me at Lillian_A_Black on Twitter.
My name is Sabrina. I am the associate commentaries editor for First Person Scholarly, and you can find me on Twitter at, I believe it's Sabrina SG. Sabrina ASG.
I am Chris Lawrence. I am editor-in-chief for First Person Scholar, and I'm also senior curator for Critical Distance. You can find me on Twitter at QuipsLawrence.
I'm Giuseppe Femia, and I am the podcast producer for First Person Scholar.
We've done 33 episodes. God.
Apparently, this is episode 33.
Wow, I feel so honored.
Congratulations on the double 3. And there's 4 of us, so that seems kind of wrong somehow. But anyways, so let's actually get into this a little bit and look at our first question of focus, which is, what experience are we each looking for from our role-playing games? Why don't we start with our editor-in-chief who did not get enough sleep last night, just because I think this will be a fun start.
I like to break things, and that is a characteristic or a mode of play or a goal that I have in mind, whether I'm playing tabletop or whether I'm playing computer RPGs. I find this comes to the forefront, especially when I'm playing role-playing games. I'm not sure exactly why, but I'm sure we can talk it out. But when I'm asked to play a role, I find that I'm strongly tempted as a player, more so than as a character, to stretch the systems of the play environment, see what I can do to bend rules, break them, subvert expectations. A really simple throwaway example would be recently I've been playing through The Witcher 3, getting kind of frustrated by what I guess I have identified as, stronger linear railroading or level gating than I expected in such a lauded RPG. So as a result, I've been going out of my way to tromp about the countryside, attacking dragons with skulls above their health bar, indicating that they are grossly overleveled and that I should not be messing with them.
That honestly sounds like half of my experience with The Witcher, although usually I didn't win in those fights with the dragons. But it's actually quite interesting that one of your main experiences is actually to test the boundaries of these role-playing games, where the sort of expectation of these games is that it provides you an opportunity, that sort of escapism that I'm sure we'll talk a bunch more about throughout this podcast. But you're absolutely right in that so many of these games are in a way still quite linear and they focus you on a specific path. So it's definitely an interesting inversion for you to fight against that. But before we get too far forward, I'm thinking we should actually each introduce our own experience with role-playing games a little bit. Just a quick 30-second blurb about our experience with them. We'll just do a round circle from Chris, Sabrina, Joey, and then myself.
I probably have the least experience with tabletop role-playing systems of anybody at this podcast today. I've played D&D in long-term campaigns over the past, but I've been out of practice for the last few years. I've also participated in a few one-offs, and I've made a bunch of characters, but usually not for myself, usually when helping other people helping people to get games up and running. I think I've played a grand total of 4 different characters myself over the course of my tabletop experiences. Should I also be talking about like computer RPGs, or can I just leave it at the tabletop stuff?
If you want to leave it at the tabletop stuff, you can. I'm going to be talking about computer RPGs because that's pretty much all I do.
Okay. I don't know how to summarize that. We can move on. Sorry.
Okay, Sabrina, how about you?
So my experience with RPGs is mainly like computer or console RPGs. I've been playing those since I don't even remember, probably since I was 4, with Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time being my very first and also still my favorite. But I've been playing those for many years, and then with tabletop, I only got started experience with that from, I want to say, summer of 2018. So I don't have too much experience. I've played Dungeons and Dragons, the 5e edition, and the One Ring. I actually had to be a dungeon master for the One Ring for an assignment, and that was fun. But I've maybe made about, I don't know, I want to say 4 or 5 characters for myself, and yeah, that's pretty much my experience.
Cool. And Joey, how about you?
Well, I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for almost a decade now, and I've been the DM for about 4 years. And in that time, I've made over 100 characters and portrayed about 30 of them, which isn't a great return rate on my character creation to play ratio. But yeah, I'm probably the most knowledgeable person about D&D in the entire Games Institute, and I will fight anybody who says different.
All right, for those of you from the Games Institute listening, that's an official invitation. We are going to have a trivia night of D&D lore at some point, and the winner gets to take on the podcast producer role. So my role in this is mostly just as kind of question asker and mediator, because my experiences are largely bound to video game RPGs. I have some experience with single player RPGs, stuff like The Witcher, Persona, Nier Automata. You'll hear me rant about pretty much every podcast episode. I have some experience with MMORPGs, Destiny, if you'll call it that. Played a little bit of Terra and admittedly Star Trek Online when I was in high school. And then, of course, a little bit experience with Dungeons and Dragons, but it's been quite minimal, mostly just one-shots. But let's get back to our main point at hand. We were listening to Chris talk about breaking and bending the rules.
Yeah, I think that's really intriguing because normally when I think of role-playing games, I think of assuming the role of the character that was either given to me if it's a video game or the one that I've created. So the fact that you use it as an opportunity to get into the game and bend or break the rules is, to me, really intriguing because that's kind of not where my brain would have gone. So that's kind of cool.
All right, then how's about you, Sabrina? What's your experience that you're looking for from a role-playing game?
For myself, it's very much about assuming the role that has kind of been assigned. I kind of like being a little bit of an actor when I'm playing games. So if it's a role-playing game that's a video game, then I like to, like, most recently I was playing Horizon Zero Dawn, so I really enjoy getting my mind into the mind of Aloy and assuming that character. And then in terms of if it's a character I've created, I usually like to have my very first playthrough as trying to experience what I think I would be like, but better. And then every playthrough after that, it's about, okay, let's be the exact opposite of what I am in every imaginable way.
So I don't know about our actual dungeon master here, but I can confirm for myself that the first time I played a D&D character, it basically just turned out being me. I wouldn't even say me, but better. But that seems like a pretty common thing to happen. As far as falling into the role of Aloy, that sort of immersion piece of that seems like a really interesting thing that I'm willing to bet a lot of game developers would actually want their players to do. It makes those stories more compelling, and I hope we can hear you talk more about that moving forward. Joey, what about you?
So, with the experience that I've had so far, what I go to the table looking for is usually some cheap therapy. When it comes to putting yourself in a role, Sabrina, Lia, you're absolutely right. And yes, people are used to just making themselves as a character, and those probably make the most compelling characters. So when you create an entirely new character, it is completely your take on that character, and somebody else will probably have a different take, but you'll always go about it in a way that kind of suits your role within whatever world the dungeon master is creating. So whatever problems they have, sometimes and most of the time align with the problems that you have in reality, whether they be like problems with family or like problems with just your confidence going into social situations. They can easily be addressed within the role playing that you do. And I only have like one dungeon master I actually trust to do this with. So when it comes to that kind of like resolution or like that kind of character development that I'm looking for in myself, I can craft a character to kind of help me find that like mental state that I'm looking for, in which I can have some resolve around a current problem I'm having, or something that I've been having, a problem I've been having for a few years.
That's really interesting. The way that I'm expecting Dungeons and Dragons especially really affords you that opportunity to tweak and alter characters to get at those very particular aspects of what you're wanting to work with. Whereas something more like The Witcher even is prefab. It gives you something to work with and you just kind of have to work from there.
Yeah, what I definitely find is with the particular culture, like with The Witcher, you get like one choice of character with like one particular background. Whereas with Dungeons and Dragons, you get to make your own character with like a preset culture. Like it's not just, oh, you can be a white male human to play this game. It goes beyond that. It goes, can you be a half elf, half orc that like don't have a kind of like a place in society? They have to take on one culture or the other. Are you someone who sees yourself as like superior to others? Are you like this high 800-year-old high elf that's just like, I'm better at magic than all of you? Or are you just this person with anger issues that gets amazing bonuses to their strength modifiers? And that is essentially what brings out your own personability, or like your own persona into this character.
Cool. Either Chris or Sabrina, anything? I have lots that I could speak about that, but I want to make sure we're hearing from everybody.
I mean, aside from refraining from the obligatory persona pun, I think I'm going to let you say your piece, Leo.
So I think it's really interesting. You were talking about the orcs, especially, and I expect we can get into the goblins and the half-orcs and everything else kind of looping in depending on the D&D extended universe that you're working in. The operating sort of on the outskirts of society, not really having a place or a role. There's a lot of metaphor that is going into that, both innately and kind of accidentally. And that's something that not being able to cite anything off the top of my head, so help me, I've seen and heard a lot of queering happen for those character roles. I believe, Chris, please feel free to correct me, it was Elise originally had done a D&D queered version of the world.
Yeah, she came up with a system called the QAF Character Generator, which basically randomizes with a high degree of player control every trait and statistic that a character has, ranging from cultural upbringing, gender identity, sexual preferences, if any, personality traits, disabilities, etc. And she wrote about it extensively in an article that you can find on First Person Scholar.
Why do I feel like that's the sort of thing that my parents unknowingly did while I was growing up?
In what way?
In the randomizing beyond their knowledge with less degree of control, what degree of queered being they were creating.
Oh yeah, no, they prayed to RN Jesus.
Pretty much. But that actually kind of gets to my personal experience, what I'm looking for with role-playing games. For me, as much as I enjoy something like The Witcher or even Nier Automata, where it provides a story for you that you have to go through, I kind of toe the line between Sabrina and Chris, where I like playing the game for the story that it has, but really trying to create my own story within it. I very much try to queer the narratives that are going on, whether it's explicitly made possible, like something with Dragon Age, where you actually have the option of creating your character, making them have whatever love interest that you want, Or if it is something like Nier, where rather than to be supposedly being interested in 9S, I have to be interested in the operator instead in my own mind. I construct that story there. So I try to find a way to narratively tweaks, not so much rule break, because I still can't fight those drakes when they're 30, 40 levels above me.
I mean, neither can I, but it doesn't stop me from trying, God help me.
That pretty much defines every one of our dating lives, I'm sure.
I mean, I also made the fool-ass choice of trying to play Nier Automata on hard mode. And after restarting the intro, I think 8 or 9 times, I finally relented and said, okay, I'm not going to get the story if I'm just fighting with the mechanics the whole way through.
That in itself is a really interesting spot for us to dive. The mechanics fighting us. I know for me personally with D&D, the mechanics fight me a lot to the point that I just accepted that I'm never going to play a caster because I just can't navigate it. So I decided to make a monk and just punch really good.
I could go on forever about mechanics fighting against me. Oh my god. I just specifically for D&D, and I think a lot of it depends on the type of dungeon master that you get. Because like in the campaign, the long-term campaign that I'm in right now, my DMs are really good about trying to get what we want worked into the story. But I know I've got a couple other friends who try to be DMs, and all they do is just like, no, it's very much based off of these rudimentary mechanics. Like it can't be broken this way. It has to be this way. And so then you kind of end up losing the story. But like when you have a good dungeon master that, like one of my characters really wanted a hellhound. To be honest, I obviously wanted the hellhound as a pet. And it took like a month for the DM to figure out how to work it in there, but he eventually did, just not in the way I wanted. He gave me a chihuahua instead, but that's fine. But like I had another friend that I used to work with. Whenever he DMs, if he can't figure out how to, like if, he's going based off of the strict outline mechanics and he can't figure out how to make it work, then he just immediately says, nope, can't do that. So then we end up fighting over it. And it's just very frustrating.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to be said on the rules around it, whether it's a DM, an actual person operating within the constructed confines of a rule set, and if they're willing to kind of break out of it a little bit, or if it is something more explicit like the rules in a video RPG. But I really want to focus in on something that you corrected yourself on, but I don't think you needed to, where you said your character and then you said I wanted the hellhound, and that sort of interesting distinction between player and character in an RPG.
Yeah, so I found with this character, when I was first designing her, I tried to make her very much not what I thought was not me. And then as I started playing her, I realized that I ended up, the character was actually just me, but in an extreme version. And so it's hard often for me to differentiate what does Sabrina want versus what does, my character's name is Knivney, what does Knivney want? And often it's one and the same, but there are times where I know Knivney would want to do something this way and I would never do it that way. But so it becomes an interesting kind of like mental struggle that I have, where is this actually something that my character would do, or am I just kind of projecting what I want, which is a hellhound? But it ends up being okay for the most part because of the similarities between my character and I. But had I been actively trying to not have any aspect of myself in a character, A, that would be very difficult, but B, then it would be kind of, I would have to do that thinking a little bit more intensely than I do right now.
And that probably operates against what you're looking for, like what your main experience you want to see in the game is, where you want to have that sort of acting potential and that association, that immersion.
Exactly. Like if I'm being too much of myself in it, then I'm not acting. I'm just being me. And that's why I do have to step back sometimes and think, what would the character want? And it's mainly just because I'm so obsessed with creating, if it's Dungeons and Dragons, with creating the story, or if it's, a video game RPG, then playing the story as it as it was initially intended, or whatever, at least for the first time around. So when I'm making a character, and if the character is what I think not at all like me, and then I notice that I start inserting my own wants and desires into it, it ends up completely going against what I initially wanted out of that experience. So it's a really weird line that I have to kind of walk sometimes.
There seem to be a lot of lines that we all walk in role-playing games. So if there's nothing else that we want to add on that, why don't we move to the next question and start looking at the fact that a lot of people get some certain satisfactions from games that they don't necessarily have in their lives. So what allowances or what affordances does role-playing personally give each of us that we don't have in the real world? Let's do the same circle and start with Chris.
Well, what I have to say here, I think, kind of ties into Joey's point about how D&D can kind of be cheap therapy, or have impromptu therapeutic properties if you're, playing with a good group that you trust. I'm a terribly anxious person in real life. I find it inhibits my behaviors and responses in a wide variety of contexts and situations. And my response to that, and also this probably has something to do with my desire to push up against systems, is I tend to play really brash, assertive, extroverted characters in tabletop settings. The character I'm probably going to be drawing upon the most in examples throughout the rest of the talk is the one that I played through a long campaign. His name was Izdranir, which was fiendishly opaque, and everyone just called him Izzy for short. This actually also, I think, touches upon Sabrina's discussion of struggling with systems. I'm not very good with the numbers in D&D. I'm definitely that player who has to be told over and over which number on the character sheet I should be looking at and which dice I should be picking up and rolling every turn. I like to think I make up for it with my on-brand charisma. But your mileage may vary. Anyway, my response to not having a super firm grasp of the systems, or really the willpower to learn them, was to roleplay a character who also didn't understand the systems. I played a character who had experienced a bit of memory loss and thought that he was a powerful archmage, but he was classed as a barbarian. So most of the time, I would respond accordingly and I would act like a barbarian. But if I didn't know what to do, or if I ran out of ideas, I would start acting like I was a mage, and I would try to cast powerful spells that weren't on my character sheet, and I would become really insufferable as I was declaring my grandiose intentions to incinerate the battlefield around me. And it fell to our poor DM, which in this case was Elise, to consult my dice rolls, and I had pretty good luck stats, and come up with environmental explanations for why things blew up when I wanted them to, despite the fact I had no innate magic power.
I kind of regret not having seen or heard any of that, because that's actually incredible. It's interesting. I think anxiety is probably quite common, both amongst people at this table, people listening, and people who play role-playing games in general. But I think it's interesting that seemingly both you and Joey, but perhaps in slightly different ways, go about navigating that and challenging it almost. Where from what I'm hearing, you seem to kind of, with that safe table space, not quite invert your personality, but challenge yourself to go a little above and beyond what you might be comfortable with on a daily basis.
Yeah. And again, there's that there's that liminal space between character and player where I'm playing characters that are more extroverted on paper, but that also requires me to be performative in ways that I don't always feel I have license to be in other situations. I'm relying on the character as an opportunity to perform because I do enjoy performing. Like Sabrina was talking about, I enjoy acting, for lack of a better word. And sometimes I'll prepare soliloquies in advance, insufferable as that sounds when I reflect on it. And I enjoy kind of the larger than life experience that comes with participating at the tabletop with a circle of friends that you trust.
That's actually incredibly sweet. Okay. Please come in when this is all said and done with some monologue prepared for our next meeting, because I really want to hear one of those. But that space for performance, I think, is a really interesting thing to dig into. And maybe Sabrina might have something to speak to about that, because it seems like sort of a shared space there.
Yeah, I don't really have, I don't do full on monologues, unfortunately, because I'm not that creative, but I do like one of the friends in our campaign, he actually will write out the recaps, but he'll write them as if they're chapters in a book. So he'll invite us to sort of over embellish whatever we want to do. And then if we can't think of anything, he'll do it on behalf of some of us. But often I use it as an opportunity to let my character just kind of run free, and I won't do it so eloquently as when he puts it into writing, but I just kind of start speaking as if I am that character and just go off on tangents about my character likes to make flower crowns. So whenever there's any lull in action, I just often very loudly my character will object, like, I am going to go make flower crowns now and or look for something shiny, and then I just kind of over embellish that. So it's fun because I get to perform this character that has now grown very near and dear to my heart. But I don't have to worry so much about how I perform it, because it's kind of my friend will help us when we're rewriting the recap. He'll help kind of put it into more eloquent and put the words together when we can't think of them, basically. So it's really fun because then it's a collaborative effort we're all essentially playing each other's characters to some extent.
That's sort of not a perfectionism necessarily, but from what I kind of both hear, that safe space allows an opportunity for error, if you will, where in daily life, as much as people try to be forgiving and acknowledge things, there are situations that you seemingly can't allow yourself to get wrong. And D&D especially, as much as the DM may punish you for getting things wrong, really does allow you that sort of opportunity to play and experiment. And I think that is a really important piece of both of them, both the experiment but also play. It is in the title, after all. But it's one of those things that I think might be so obvious that at least I personally overlook more often than not. Anybody have any other thoughts on anxiety, games, wanting to feel safe at a specific table? Or should we let Sabrina go on another little rant? Sabrina rant?
All right, I can Sabrina. Always do rants.
What allowances do you look for that you don't have in real life?
So similar along the lines of the kind of when Chris was talking about the anxiety issues and how it can sort of allow to work through that. Mine has been mainly not quite anxiety, but confidence related to body image. So there's a lot of people that will, be upset, rightfully so, by the depictions of female characters, specifically in video games, video game RPGs rather. But for myself, because I kind of grew up being really weird with, like, I never fully accepted the way my body looked. I was too tiny, and I didn't like it. Whenever I saw these female characters that looked really attractive or whatever, rather than, and this could just be me, but rather than be upset that I don't look like that, I assumed that role, and it made me feel better. And it kind of helped me work through my own body image issues, in the sense that rather than look at it as something to aspire to, I looked at it as I can become that in this instance, in this context. And it was just really fun, because that allowed for me to work through some things, especially when I was younger, that I didn't know how else to work through. And being a dancer, well, I used to be a dancer. There's a lot of issues with body, and the dance studio will want you to do one thing, but the rest of society is telling you to do something slightly different. And then, your mom's worried that you're not eating enough, so she's telling you to do something else. So for me, when I assumed a role of a very powerful, very attractive female presenting character, I became that. And for that moment in that context, it allowed me to pretend or to experience what it would be like to have that ideal. And that's kind of, it's not as much now about the body image, but it is now still about, does this character have something that I aspire to have? And then can I experience what it would be like to have that for this short period of time that I'm playing this game?
I can feel pretty much all of that on a very personal level. I've had very similar experiences, though slightly different. I think it's interesting to me, especially the sort of aspirational nature of role-playing games on your upbringing and how you see yourself. And that's not only that sort of acting that we were talking about with you earlier, but there is that sort of acting made real, almost. As much as you can't be a 7-foot tall high elf with a raptor steed, you can, in a way, channel the confidence that she might have into yourself. And I know, meeting you in person, you have that confidence.
Why, thank you. But yeah, it is definitely, it is the main, and even like it is mainly for female characters for me, but even with certain male characters, like I always go back to Ezio, because when I was playing a lot of Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood in high school, I was very much not confident, and I still was able to find confidence by channeling Ezio in other aspects of my life, and also while I was playing the game, because he's just like ridiculously confident and cool, in my opinion. So I kind of was able to channel that a little bit. It's just easier for me to do it with female characters, and I look for it more in them. But even with certain male characters, that aspiration piece of it is still there, and so it's still very much important.
That sort of brazen confidence that some forms of masculinity might afford, that a sort of more traditional feminine character may not allow, and that sort of intersection of the two, and the allowance of the game, but also you allowing yourself to kind of break from those traditional gender norms and understand that both of these are worthwhile things to interact with, understand, and potentially take on. I'm just hoping you didn't think that needed you to actually like walk around assassinating people in high school.
No, not at all. Not at all.
What about the other two? Any thoughts on Sabrina's seeming desire to assassinate people?
No, that's normal.
I mean, I support it. I'd encourage it.
And what about the growing of confidence and using... I'm guessing there's some commonality between the anxiety piece and the confidence piece, but it seems to be sort of a different manner of coming at potentially a slightly different question.
Well, we've been talking about role playing as a confidence, as a not necessarily confidence building, but confidence exploring kind of exercise, and how that intersects in particular with feminine representation in games. It brought to mind a piece that I collected for Critical Distance a couple of weeks back on Vice about kind of the troubled role that women play in Blizzard games in particular. And it's a trope that's been noted by a few people now, but this article by Nico Deo, and I apologize if I've mispronounced that, that was published a few weeks ago, discusses this trope where all the strong women in Blizzard games tend to follow the same pattern. And I'm quoting here: an angular beauty with lilac skin and a traumatic backstory to explain how a nice girl ended up in the mass murder business. Title of the article is Blizzard's Long History of Manic Pixie Nightmare Girls and Fear of Women. And the article goes into this discussion of how you've got these badass women who play anti-hero or villainous roles in Blizzard games in particular, but that there's problems with that representation because it alienates and dehumanizes women while at the same time sexualizing them. So they're kind of pigeonholed into this very particular antagonized, sexualized niche that they have to operate if they're going to be credible, commanding characters. And I wonder, I guess the reason I'm bringing this article up is I wonder how that reflects on our D&D experiences when our inclinations are often to either exaggerate or invert things that we're working through and dealing with in real life. Like, are we all, in a sense, kind of becoming manic pixie nightmare girls in our quest to find satisfying roleplay experiences that we can take back with us into, for lack of a better word, meat space, material space?
Meat space. Well, I don't know about the other two, but personally, I like to think that I already am a manic pixie nightmare girl, but I know that that's just not the case. But yeah, I think it's a piece that I'm going to have to go read now. But the association and the exaggeration of the self and a sort of cultural perceived ideal, not even necessarily a cultural ideal, and how it distinguishes from our personal desires and even necessarily what the game would desire the player to do. I think that's an interesting thing to dig into and really try to understand that correlation.
I would definitely think that I'm a manic pixie nightmare girl. I mean, but that's just me. Yeah, I'm not really even sure how. I definitely want to go read this piece now, but like I'm in such a weird spot where I don't even know what to think or how to think, because I don't know, it just seems to be a really weird, conflicting spot for me to be in when I'm trying. I don't even know. I'm losing half my thoughts as I'm trying to think of how to even respond to this, if that makes any sense that this could happen. But yeah, I don't know.
There's a certain point of truth being spoken that there's only so much that you can add to it. And I think what Chris just said there is pretty freaking on the mark.
Exactly.
Okay. I want to go over to Joey. What allowances do role-playing games provide you beyond just low-cost therapy?
Well, as a player, yeah, low-cost therapy. Aside, like, building the character is probably the funnest part, but I think DMing is the role that I really want to fill, because let's be honest, even though DMs get a lot of shit from their players, they are still gods in this world that they've created. They have the power to create and destroy on a whim, and then they have the option whether to be an angry god or a responsible god. And when you take on that kind of responsibility for your players, you get to kind of not give them the experience, but allow them to have the experience in the world that you set up specifically for them. And whether they prefer the experience of like this cruel, uncaring world that wants to step all over them, or if they want to have their hand held through the entire game, that is something that you have to figure out while you're like talking and like role playing with them. Just the other day when I was DMing on Sunday, there was like this reunion between one of the main characters and his mother, and I was role-playing the mother, and I was able to bring myself to tears, and he was also able to bring himself to tears, and everybody else at the table was freaking the hell out because, like, oh my god, this is still a game, but like, why is there so much emotion behind it? And this kind of game allows me to be a responsible god in the sense where I don't want to kill them, but I want them to still have this experience that they themselves are responsible for. So if they had never gone home, he would have never had that experience. And that would have been an entire faucet of the game that just didn't have to be opened up.
And I'm guessing as the DM, there's a whole lot of detail and construction that you've done that never gets opened up.
Oh yeah, are you kidding me? There's so many like things that I've written down for generic villages, like, oh, this one's being attacked by a werewolf. This one has a vampire that's in love with the priest. This one has a wishing fountain that if you steal coins from it, it'll curse you with no money. And so many of them go unused, but at the same time, I have them in the back of my mind for the purposes of when they come across generic Village X. If they kind of like want to stay there, want to meet people that are there, I have a bunch of characters that I can just stick into that world. But when it actually, because that's like the matrix rendering that I have to do behind the scenes. But it's like, for what it allows you, it gives you this kind of responsibility that is unique to the game, that you are essentially playing the role of the mechanic system of a computer for The Witcher. Like, you have to keep track. You are the person who keeps the rules. You're the person that keeps them on board. And there's this balancing act that you have to do between the actual story and between the actual like written down rules. And some people are more story based. Some people are more rules based. I find that you can't be all about the rules. Otherwise, the numbers, you might as well just be playing a video game at that point. You're a cold, heartless machine. But if you're doing the role playing and you're actually getting involved and you're engaging with the players, there's so much more that you can be doing to like aid them in their quest to have fun.
You are our benevolent god of a DM.
No, I'm not.
I think that's interesting, that sort of space for control that you have as a DM, where you both have a choice to make yourself, but it also does boil down to that interaction with your players and what they're looking for. And that sort of intersection of narrative construction, balance of rules versus story versus player desire, kind of coming back to Sabrina's Hellhound Chihuahua, where there's that sort of necessary skill set that you have to form that people might not think is transferable, but I'd be willing to argue that it is, where you really have to navigate a lot of different things at one time. And that sense that you don't always have a right answer through all of that. And that sort of experience, not just as a player of trying new things, but of a DM and actually learning some of those broader understandings, not only of the system, but of how similar systems might operate in real life. That's the end of my like really good thought. I can just keep rambling, but I'd be happy if somebody else.
Joey, just to get me going again, could you give me like a summary prompt of what you were saying about being a benevolent god and managing players and systems and narratives?
When you become like this person that all the other players give responsibility to and trust in and have confidence in, you are the person that needs to be like on top of things. You have to be the one that not only schedules the games, but also makes it interesting and allows the players to have this fulfilling experience that they wouldn't otherwise get. Even though you do have the option to drop a dragon on them every 5 seconds, there's no fun in that. And a part of what becomes a responsible DM or responsible god is allowing for the experience that they want or they would and be entertained by to happen.
Okay, that makes me think of an article that I collected a few months ago for Critical Distance from a blog by B. Gabriel, who was looking at the actual play podcast Friends at the Table. And again, I'm going to give you a quotation here. Tabletop role-playing games are at their best when there is a dialectical tension between the GM and the players. The GM rules the world. She sets up situations, guides the players through them, plays the people they encounter, and enforces the rules. The players take control of one person within the world, embodying them to the best of their abilities. When they press hard enough, the world breaks. And I think that's something that touches upon kind of threads we've all been stringing together throughout this discussion. Not only that tension, but the potential outcomes of successfully navigating that tension.
Yeah, and in my experience, the most fun in D&D is when the player figures out how to break the world in some aspect or another, whether it be role-playing, if they've played their role so well that everybody at the table is hooting and hollering and just laughing at the insane thing that happened that is not just like, oh, every 5 seconds I'm going to do something funny, but like, holy shit, I can't believe that he was able to pull this off just by going up and talking to this person. Or would just in terms of like the abilities that you get mechanically, if you're able to do something really fucking epic in like a combat or something, you breaking the game in a way that makes it entertaining for those around you, that kind of gives the player a bit more power than the DM has at that moment in time, is probably one of the most fulfilling experiences that you can have in D&D.
Cool. That sort of breaking tension or walking the kind of tightrope of all of that seems to be, like Chris was saying, a very common thread through all of it, whether it's walking that line of breaking the rules, whether it's sort of pushing back on the tense boundary of expectation, confidence building, and self-representation, or if it's the navigation of a set of rules, a set of desires. It seems to kind of go everywhere. And in a way, that's what kind of I find as the main allowance that I have in role-playing games that I don't necessarily have in, or historically didn't have in my day-to-day life. As a trans person, I often went to games as that sort of bodily construction, that sort of aspirational ideal, like Sabrina was talking about as well. Though in my case, it was potentially a little more dramatic, explicit, to pick whatever word you want to have, where I was taking on not just physical manifestations of what I wanted to be, but also more social, experimental, experiential ones. But interestingly, particularly as I've gone through my transition and have started being more confident in who I am now, even when I was designing my sim in Sims 4, not that it's a role-playing game, though in a way it sort of is. There's a lot of commonality between role-playing and simulation games. I was looking to take on a character that is more representative of me now than I necessarily would have through history. Where for me, role-playing games sort of manifested my desires in that sort of way, where historically it was, I want to be feminine, I want to be seen in this way, whereas now, after living my life like I want to be as the sort of STEM trans lesbian that I am, I kind of realized that, you know what, no, I don't need to be that sort of culturally understood role of femininity. I can challenge that tension through role-playing, find out what works for me before I necessarily take that on in my everyday life. But yeah, that's my little ramble before we move on to our last question, unless anybody wants to quickly add anything. No? Okay. I think this is going to be a relatively short question, but I think this is probably going to be the most fun question of all of them. Which of the characters that we've role-played have given us the greatest experience? And why don't we invert the circle this time and start with Joey?
Okay. So I've played way too many characters over the years. To narrow down the greatest experience would be If I'm not including self-insert characters, there's no one. So for the sake of argument, one particular character that I started off playing, I think it was the first real character I made for myself in D&D, because up until that point I was going on the path of the murder hobo, and I was trying to either be this like benevolent guardian or this person that was just in it for jokes and would stab anyone at their earlier convenience. And eventually my friends, because they were making fun of me, I got sick of that, and I encouraged myself to kind of create a character that can be taken a bit more seriously. And Jesus Christ, was he an edgelord. I created a character called Haigle Foolsbait, who was this warlock-esque guy, the prince of a kingdom and a person that was hell-bent on becoming a god, or like one that was supported by another god to like surpass him. This was more of like a coming-of-age thing for me, because when I initially created them, I was 19, and there was this sort of social disconnect that I had between my friends at the time, and all of the obsession that I had went into this character. Everything that I was slowly became this character, and I realized a lot about the world around me and the disillusionments that came with a lot of the things that I had taken for granted. Long story short, this character, going from an evil prick that he was to kind of this more or less, not Zuko character arc, but like, oh, I can tolerate this person in the same room now, kind of helped me grow as a person. And that was probably the greatest experience I got from one of the characters that I've ever played, because it was real. And it went through this very real aspect of my life that I was able to actually get help with and navigate my internal psyche within the context of the game.
That's amazing.
That's rad.
Even that D&D not only allowed you to do that, but that you were in a situation that you could make it happen yourself. I think is a really interesting dynamic there.
It's also the reason that I know almost everything about 5th edition now.
And then all of a sudden I go and throw something from 3rd at you and have to figure out where that fits into play.
Yep.
But okay, we are running a little short on time, so let's continue around the circle and get to Sabrina.
This is actually a really tough question for me, because I'm so tempted to say Ezio from Assassin's Creed, oddly enough, because part of that was just, it was when I really started to get into role-playing games, so it was just the most fun. But I think at the same time, the one that's given me the most dynamic experience would have to be my current character for my long-term campaign for D&D, which is Niveni, because basically she's got a split personality thing going on because she's possessed by a demon. So I get to play two very extremes of personality types, and that's just been the absolute greatest kind of acting challenge, which is kind of what I look for. But at the same time, I mean, I can't go wrong with Ezio, and he's got a very, very special place in my heart, because he's basically the main reason why I started getting into game studies.
Cool.
Nice.
I feel like that's what this last question is going to be. Just a lot of us like acknowledging and appreciating each other's experiences.
Well, we can acknowledge it differently, like, holy shit. Dear God. That's a word.
Sabrina's actually like a late 20s, early 30s Italian man from Renaissance Italy.
100%. I'm convinced that that's what I was in a past life, if past lives exist.
I'm on the note that they are, so let's...
Life existed before us, yeah.
Not necessarily where we're going. But, Chris, how about you?
Well, I thought I was going to close this out talking about Izzy again, but it occurs to me that the singular greatest experience I ever had was actually a one-off. Now, the background context for the situation was I was playing with a fairly well-acquainted group of players who had gotten some experience, but we were now onboarding a group of new players who'd never played D&D before. So the idea behind it wasn't, I guess a one-off isn't quite the way to describe it, but kind of a transitional one-night episode where the new players would get acquainted with their characters and the veteran players would play effectively disposable one-off characters that were meant to be killed over the course of the adventure, requiring the new players to kind of step up and giving them an opportunity to shine. The character I played, I do not recall his name for the life of me. He was a paladin. He was basically Zap Brannigan from Futurama. He was a completely boorish, insufferable asshole. Overconfident, yet also prodigally incompetent. This character should have died on the first roll. He did not. I kept getting really lucky rolls. So I spent the night role playing this absolutely insufferable piece of shit paladin, antagonizing the other players, and basically just leading the charge in a fight that I had no business winning. By the end of the night, the campaign was effectively resolved. I don't remember exactly what the villain at the end was. Let's just say he was a necromancer. He was defeated by being sealed in a bottle. He was helpless, powerless. We had won. The threat was over. And I thought to myself, okay, what would this exceptionally arrogant piece of shit Zap Brannigan type caricature do now? So I picked the bottle up and I drank it. And our DM, which again was Elise, asked me to roll, and it was a 1. So Zap Brannigan, the paladin, exploded. And that was the end of the night.
That's
Holy
amazing.
shit.
A fitting end to an otherwise rackish evening. A mid-season special. Okay, so for me, I could go with my tiefling paladin of the one shot that I did first, who very quickly got decapitated by a bugbear. It was rather dramatic. But I'm actually going to pull a Chris and draw a quote from actually, as of the recording of this podcast, the newest post on First Person Scholar, which is the gendered mechanics of Pokemon Sword and Shield, and specifically looking at Autumn's one passage where she really gets into her experience, which I actually really associated with, which was the playing of Pokemon Diamond for her and actually Pokemon Ruby for me as a female avatar when we wouldn't necessarily have had that knowledge or possibility otherwise. So for me, even when I wasn't necessarily thinking about it or vocalizing or having the language to understand who I was and what my role in this world was, I subconsciously opened up Pokemon Ruby on my little red Nintendo Advance SP, and Professor, not Oak, not Birch, Professor Dude Bro asks me, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And I'm just like, I don't need to think about this. I'm a girl. And the adventure went from there. And I very vividly remember my brother asking me, "Why are you playing as a girl?" And to this day, I don't remember what I told him, but I remember when I think back now and just go, how did I not know a hell of a lot sooner what was going on? So I'm going back to my youth, and I'm going to call Pokemon a proper role-playing game for the purposes of this.
Honestly, I think that's amazing.
100 emoji.
Holy shit.
You can't see me, but I'm doing peace signs on this side. But Okay, so I think that pulls us pretty much to time. So thank you everybody for calling in and being here on this rainy Friday afternoon in the midst of social distancing. So let's do a quick once around, say once again who we are, what we do, and where you can find us. So I'm Lia Black. I'm the commentary section editor at First Person Scholar, and you can find me at Lillian_A_Black on Twitter.
I'm Sabrina. I am the associate commentaries editor for First Person Scholarly, and as a correction to when I first said it, you can find me at Sabrina Alicia SG on Twitter.
I've been Chris Lawrence, Editor-in-Chief for First Person Scholar and Senior Curator for Critical Distance. You can find me on Twitter at QuipsLawrence.
I am Giuseppe Femia, and I am the podcast producer at FPS. You can find me at the Games Institute.
Fair enough. So, thanks for listening to us talk about our role-playing game experiences and what these experiences mean on a broader scale. What do you think about what we had to say? Let us know what you aim to get from role-playing games and who your favorite characters to roleplay have been. You can find us at FPS Weekly, or start a conversation with us using the hashtag FirstPersonPodcast on Twitter. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia with support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.